Over to you, Saloni.
Hello. Sorry, I just switched off my fan, which is why you probably saw me disappearing. So hopefully it's not too noisy and you can hear me nicely and clearly. So I have a terrible honking cold. It is luckily not COVID, but I don't recommend any summer colds. So if I kind of doze off in the middle, you know why. But I wanted to tell you about some work that I've been carrying out in my lab over the last 2 or 3 years. And one of the I guess I would define myself as a developmental cognitive neuroscientist. And so in general, I tell people that I like to put kids in scanners and find out what's different about their brains. Of course, over the last 2 years, because of a certain virus, it's been incredibly difficult to do anything like that. So a lot of my research has kind of pivoted to being online, and I've been trying to use particularly Gorilla to kind of deliver and ask interesting new questions that didn't necessarily involve putting children in scanners. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the role of reward in adolescent word learning. So I guess I want to start off by making a pitch, given that this is a fairly diverse audience, in terms of why vocabulary is important. One reason is that we constantly encounter and learn new words through our lives. Brexit, you probably didn't really know about Brexit pre-2015. COVID, definitely didn't know about that pre-2020. Cronut, we kind of encounter these new words all the time. And we also know that children with reading and language disorders can struggle with word learning, particularly acquiring new phonological forms. And we know things like vocabulary knowledge are a predictor of school success and eventually also life achievement. So it seems that part of this process around kind of acquiring new words is really, really important. And lots of researchers focus on kind of different aspects of this problem. So most theories focus on how words are learned. So like, how do you assign a specific word to a specific object? But one of the things that I really care about and started to care about a lot in the last few years is why do we learn new words? Why do we inherently find this interesting, exciting? Why do we seek this out? And so I guess the question I'm going to be posing today is word learning intrinsically rewarding, because it's not that someone comes and gives you £5 every time you encounter a new word or you learn a new word. So is there something that is an intrinsic driver from us? If so, is word learning intrinsically rewarding for all groups? I'm going to be talking about one particular paradigm today, which is learning words in context. This is not the only paradigm that I've used, but in the interest of time, I thought it might be better to kind of keep things kind of limited to one paradigm that I could explain well. So this is a really, really classic psycholinguistic paradigm. It's been around since the 70s, and it's been used loads and loads of time. And the basic premise would be that we can learn the meaning of new words by the context that they occur in. So if I give you this sentence, few countries are now ruled by a Saich. Now, Saich is not a real word. I've made up this word. But the question is, like, you might be able to kind of guess maybe what the meaning of this word is. And if you see the next sentence, in the palace lives the king and the Saich, then you might have a much better guess. And if you're thinking Saich seems something like a queen, then you would be right. And there are lots of examples of how we do this sort of in the wild. And again, lots of people have been really interested in sort of the diversity of the sentence context that you use, the number of encounters that you need, and so on. But one of the really nice twists on this kind of paradigm, I think, came from one of my collaborators at NYU, Pablo Rupoles, who's now an assistant professor at NYU. What he showed is in those kind of paradigms, when you learn word meaning from context, this is associated with intrinsic reward. And he demonstrated this in multiple ways. So he showed this that in terms of people's behavioral ratings, they tended to say that learning these kind of words was more pleasurable relative to when they couldn't extract the meaning of words. People's brain activity and reward processing regions like the striatum was higher when you tended to successfully learn the meanings of these words, unlike and if you didn't. Importantly, also, like you can also think about the effect of medication. So Pablo did some really nice work looking at levodopa, which had kind of increased reward responses, and risperidone, which is kind of inhibit reward responses. And he was able to show that when you gave people levodopa, it kind of boosted their learning. When you gave people risperidone, it kind of decreased or what's the right word here, decrease their learning. But the other thing that's really, really important about this kind of experience of reward is that actually experiencing that reward seems to fuel word learning. So you get memory benefits from sort of encountering and enjoying learning a new word. So you're much more likely to remember that word. So Pablo had done a lot of this work in German. So all of his studies had been in German, and all of them had been with kind of neurotypical adults. But in my work, I was really interested in trying to kind of open this up and potentially look at people, children with dyslexia, etc. And obviously being in the UK, my studies are in English. So we did a sort of a couple of different studies to try and get a handle on kind of converting and building on some of Pablo's work. So the first study I want to kind of give you a preamble onto is just to sort of say, what is the influence of modality on these sort of effects? And so here, Pablo had done all of his work looking at people reading these kind of sentences, but we also know from the literature that actually when people listen to the same kind of sentences, they also kind of extract words in the same way, extract meanings in the same way. So we hypothesized that learning new words would be intrinsically rewarding in both reading conditions as well as listening conditions. And we sort of said that, yes, intrinsic reward will also be associated with memory benefits. Now, this is actually a project that undergrad students at Royal Holloway carried out in 2020, 2021. So this is obviously something they had to do online. And it was pretty amazing for us that Gorilla existed so that we could just go off and get this data. It was not a problem at all. So I want to tell you a little bit about the paradigm. So as I've kind of demonstrated to you, you have these kind of M+ sentences. So you sort of have sentences where you encounter a novel word at the end, and they're kind of paired up so you can extract the meaning for word. Generally, after people encounter these words, they would have to type in a guess about what they thought the word was. And they would also have to give us a number of ratings. So like how confident were they, how tired were they, and how much they enjoyed that particular sentence. Interestingly, we also had a really good control, which is M- sentences. So in these sentences, these are basically jumbled up sentences from another set of M+ sentences. But here you cannot extract the meaning of a new word. And this kind of is a really good experimental control for us. So you would have things like John needed a battery for his Bemble. The teacher wrote the date on the Bemble. So it's really kind of hard to extract a meaning for the word Bemble. We presented these paradigms in a kind of reading condition, a listening condition. We also had a reading and listening condition, which is sort of akin to kind of thinking about subtitles. And this was a longitudinal study in a really, really simple way, or a learning study, because 24 hours later, people had to complete a recognition task on these words. It's also not as easy as it looks over there, because what we actually did was we didn't present these words sequentially. So you would tend to get a block of sentences. So you would encounter 4 different words, and then you would kind of encounter the pair for those words a little bit later. So it wasn't as trivial as it looks like in my kind of schematic. But yeah, the main thing is we tested native English speaking adults, and I can say more about this, but just to keep it brief, 42 of them did the reading paradigm, 36 did the listening paradigm, and 34 did the reading and listening paradigm. And I think our goal was just to get to above 30 in all of these conditions. So we were fairly happy with these numbers. So what did we find? Well, so I want you to look at the kind of MP sentences, which are shown in blue over here. Enjoyment is on the x-axis and learning is on the y-axis. And what you can very clearly see is that when people report greater enjoyment, they're also showing greater learning in the MP case. And this isn't as much the case in the MM case, which is those kind of control sentences that I talked about. So in general, when you can successfully learn a new word, but not in kind of these experimental controls, you do rate things as being more pleasurable. I just wanted to overlay those same kind of curves one on top of the other. So this is only for the MP condition where you can extract the meaning of a new word. And I just wanted to show you how similar this was across the 3 conditions. So listening, reading, and listening. One of the other things I wanted to show you is that on that recognition task again, so this is memory rather than learning on day 1. And again, the more you enjoyed learning that word on day 1, the better you were at remembering it. And this was regardless of the condition, so listening, reading, or reading and listening. My very simple kind of takeaway from that work is just to say that actually intrinsic reward is associated with memory benefits. So we kind of replicated what Pablo had already shown, but kind of expanded it into these new modality conditions. So this we felt set us up really well. And in experiment 2, we decided to test in children. And we decided specifically that we were going to investigate change over development. The age group that we wanted to focus on was late adolescence. And this is because of some work from Lisa Knoll, which had suggested that when you train older adolescents on kind of relational reasoning and numerosity discrimination, older adolescents show the kind of greatest jump in performance. And adults and younger adolescents did show kind of learning, but they weren't as pronounced as the gains. So Lisa Knoll kind of suggested that late adolescence might offer a window of opportunity for educational interventions. There's also some work from the kind of neuroscience domain, which is kind of suggesting that striatal activity is predictive of later learning performance. And there's this general idea that increased reward sensitivity would lead to increased motivational salience, and then this recruits systems for learning. So actually, this would be a really important window. Late adolescents might offer a really important window for word learning as well. And so this is what we decided to test in this particular registered report, where we test 10 to 18-year-olds with the idea of basically, and this is, I should say, this is work conducted with RAs in my lab at the time, Amrita Bains, Annalise Barber, and Tam Nell. And the hypothesis we were looking at was that learning new words while reading will be intrinsically rewarding at an early developmental stage. When we did this work, this hypothesis hadn't been tested in children and adolescents, but the kind of premise of the fact that word learning would be rewarding, we would very much expect to see this early in development if truly reward is having meaningful interactions with language learning. We also hypothesized that intrinsic reward would be related to memory benefits, as I've just shown you in the previous experiment. But importantly, we had a developmental hypothesis that the kind of reward you experience and the kind of learning from reward would increase in age and would sort of peak in late adolescence, which we thought would be somewhere between kind of 14 to 16 or 16 to 18 years. So this is a registered report. So as you know, we kind of pre-registered the plans and we got reviewers. So this has been accepted in developmental science. And for this particular project, I'm reporting data from 345 native English speaking children aged 10 to 18. All of this data was collected during the pandemic. And basically our goal was to get above 84 children based on our pre-registration in all of these brackets. So we have 84 10 to 12-year-olds, 12 to 14-year-olds, 14 to 16, and 16 to 18. I want to show you a couple of kind of emerging results. I still need to finish writing this up and submit the stage 2 submission. So this is sort of work in progress, but some very, very clear messages so far from the data. The first is, like we saw with the behavioral study I just presented to you, learning new words is rewarding. So here we only did the reading condition, but just like before, you can see that particularly in the kind of M+ situation, when you kind of enjoy, when you report greater enjoyment, you tend to get greater learning. And you see some indication of this even in the M- condition in children aged 10 to 18. What was somewhat surprising, though, and what we weren't expecting to find is that there was no effect of age. And so in some ways, hypothesis 1, which is the fact that we would replicate this data in children, is kind of surprising, because if you had any experience of registered reports, what tends to happen is that you try to replicate a finding and it doesn't replicate. But actually, we did replicate the first finding, but we didn't find any evidence for our kind of second hypothesis. So it wasn't that 14 to 16-year-olds or 16 to 18-year-olds showed greater reward, greater sort of learning due to the word. Our kind of other registered hypothesis also we don't see really good evidence for. So we don't really observe memory benefits. And I think this is partially for 2 reasons. So basically what we would have expected to find is that enjoyment was predictive of kind of accuracy on the second day of learning. But one of the problems may have been that we made this task really easy. So for children, what we did is we didn't have the complicated blocking structure that I showed you in the previous experiment. We did give them sequential sentences because we thought it would be too much for children. And in doing so, what we may have done is actually make the learning demands of the task too easy and not being able to observe these kind of memory benefits. That's one idea potentially. So I wanted to kind of summarize what I've told you so far, in terms of the science. So children and adults do find word learning intrinsically, and we want to suggest that when tasks are challenging enough, that we find that reward is associated with greater memory. We're doing some future work on this. So we're now looking at the neural basis of reward for word learning in neurotypical children and children with dyslexia. And we're also starting to understand the processes of motivation going beyond the experience of reward alone. And this is work being carried out at Royal Holloway by my postdoc, Desi. But as Joe alluded to, I wanted to talk a little bit about what has BeOnline done for us. I wanted to mention some pros and some cons, and perhaps give you some very quick tips and tricks. So in terms of the pros, the reach of the experiment, like I mentioned that we tested something like 345 children for our experiment. There is no way we would have been able to do that based on kind of strict lab settings. It just would not have happened. I've alluded to the fact that this was possible in a pandemic multiple times. There was, again, no way that we could have gone into schools and got data in any other way. Designing these tasks was really, really easy. And so that ease of design, kind of getting undergraduate project students involved in doing this and so on, was really important. Sharing and collaboration was easier. My kind of collaborator was at NYU, but it was really easy to kind of just reach out to him and say, here's the paradigm, you can look at it, you can play with it, give me your comments. And of course, Gorilla's kind of open materials makes open science, kind of sharing and after data collection also much easier. I think there are some cons. While conducting this experiment online, we realized that we were at some point getting lots of bots, and that was problematic, or people who were just kind of picking up our ads online and doing stuff, and we didn't have a check for age in any way. So obviously, if you're testing a child in real life, you can see that they're a child. But one of the things that worried us were maybe people who were kind of participating and they were adults, but they were just pretending to be children to get vouchers from the experiment. Obviously, one of the things that you get when you are watching someone do your task is a lot of insight into participant behavior. We didn't quite have that. And we did have a tech problem in one of the experiments. So one of the particular tasks that we were using needed a keyboard response, but apparently lots of children nowadays use tablets to do everything. So they would come to this task and they would fail. And then basically we needed to set up multiple versions, including a whole new day 2 experiment, just in case they had failed this one particular chunk of the task. And of course, there is a bit more cost to running these things online than, so for example, if you run things in schools, you can just give people stickers. If it's online, you need to kind of tempt people with vouchers. Tips and tricks, we suggest lots and lots of experimental controls. We had in our experiment accuracy checks, attention checks. We kind of, as I alluded to, ran a new version of just the day 2 experiment. And I think the main thing that I would say is be responsive to participants, and ideally run studies in small batches so that you can chat and email with your participants and talk to them. That's all. Sorry for going over time, Joe. That's me done. Thank you.
That was fabulous, Saloni. Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself and failing to click the button. That was absolutely brilliant. I am so impressed with the work that you've done. I'm just going to have to change my view here because I can't bear looking at myself when I'm speaking. Gosh, that was a lot of kids that you recruited. Those are big samples.
Yeah.
How did you get them?
Oh, well, that was actually, we recruited even more than I presented here. So I think overall, we probably tested something like 540 kids. And then actually, because of the kind of experimental controls that you have, you drop people out, right? So lots and lots of kids. And I guess schools, like we send a lot of emails to schools to be like, please, can you put this up? And then lots of schools were very happy to be like, you're not asking us to devote any time. People can just go do it online on this particular link. That was great. What else did we do? Lots and lots of emails, lots and lots of social media kind of pressure on people. I mean, I think part of it is like when you do a registered report, you commit to doing the numbers. So you just have to get out and
you have to get out and get them. Yes. We're getting the last 5 harder than getting the first 5.
Actually, so we realized at some point that like the for some reason, we got lots of 16 to 18-year-olds, we got lots of 10-year-olds, but the kind of in-between group, the 12 to 14-year-olds, we had this little graph where we wanted to see the numbers going up, and for some reason, we just never got 12 to 14-year-olds. So getting those last few 12 to 14-year-olds was the most challenging bit. But yeah, it works out really beautifully. And yeah,
that's amazing.
I was really, really pleased with it.
I think there are some questions coming in the Q&A, and if you're in the audience and you've got a question, please do dump it in the Q&A now. One more question from me. What types of checks did you put in, sort of like sanity checks on your data, did you put in to make sure you're getting sensible data quality?
Yeah, so luckily this was a registered report. So like the reviewers also recommended a bunch of sanity checks. There are kind of one sanity check was part of our registered report, and we basically said that if we're really seeing children, and this probably also answers some of Matt Davis's questions in the Q&A, is that we would expect that kind of extracting meaning would be increasing with age, and we find a very, very strong relationship there. So basically, accuracy in the M+ condition very strongly goes up by age. So from when you're 10, you're a little bit worse at answering those questions. When you're 18, you're much better at answering those questions. And that is definitely what we would have expected. So that's kind of helpful. At some point, we hit this vein of people on Facebook who were like emailing us. And you know, seeing those emails is really reassuring, because there's a certain way a parent communicates, and you can definitely go, yes, that definitely feels like an interaction with a real parent. There are some where we were just not sure, and then we have kind of, a lot of them luckily failed our kind of attention checks. So we had stuff like we needed to have kids complete with a certain level of accuracy. We also had embedded attention checks in there. We've also got other controls. So we've asked people about their sleep, and we've asked people about kind of, we did this task with Jason Yeatman's group called ROAR. So we have ROAR data, and again, on the ROAR, we can see, which is a lexical decision task, for those of you who know what that means. You can again see that accuracy is increasing with age, and reaction time is kind of decreasing with age. So kind of good sanity checks in there.
Very, very cool. Yes, that sounds like a comprehensive set of sanity checks. Do you want to give a more comprehensive answer to Matt, or have you answered that sufficiently? The question was, do you think it's possible that the null effects of age could be explained by dishonest age reports? I think you've just about covered that. Is there anything more?
Yeah, I don't think it would be dishonest. I mean, I'm sure that like every single person in the data we can't necessarily verify. And one thing we should have really done is kind of possibly enforce a mechanism that people could only do the task once, because I was just like, oh, person with the same email who's done my task, like you can't be another person. Yeah. So there's a little bit of kind of sanity check, kind of weeding out stuff. But I'm sure if like someone was smarter and used like a second email, that's a bit harder to kind of disentangle.
Did you consider trying to get like and use the video recording zone just to get a screenshot of the person, or would you not have got that past the ethics?
I think ethics would have been challenging. I think a few people have been talking about like getting audio recordings during consent, because obviously your voice is a really good cue of your age. And if you say something like I consent, then obviously you know that, you know, it's a native English speaker who is
it gives you
but
quite
honestly,
a lot.
like, you know, I mean, I know you don't necessarily face some of these issues, but I would be inherently extremely surprised, and I'm sure we have a couple of these sort of things in the main data set, but I would be very surprised if that was the entire explanation.
Brilliant. Saloni, could you just go back to your slide of top tips, and while Saloni's doing that, Neil, could you get your slides ready for sharing in a minute? And what I just wanted to ask the audience that we've got here today, which of the tips and tricks was most useful for you today? What was the lesson you most needed to hear? Was it about learning lots of experimental controls and separating accuracy checks and attention checks? Or was it about needing to be responsive when things go wrong and maybe creating a different version of experiment? That was something you might not consider. Or was it the being responsive to participants? Or indeed the advice on recruiting children? Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's just wonderful. It's really great if you are willing to be generous to Saloni and give the feedback that's been most helpful to you, because it helps Saloni know she's done a good job, and it's difficult giving a talk to a room of completely blank screens, and that interaction from you guys is just really rewarding to know that we are helping you learn messages that are helpful, that you're going to take into your research and will make your lives better. Now with that, Saloni, thank you so much. You were wonderful. Thank you for starting us and setting the bar so high for everybody. Next up, we've got Neil. Neil, do come across and share your slides. Neil and I first met, a few years ago. Neil's been up in Dundee studying different dialects of different languages. He's done all sorts of amazing things, including using the local radio stations to recruit his participants, which is one of the reasons I've asked him to speak today. So don't let him leave the stage without sharing how he got that to work and what impact it had on his research. Neil, over to you.
Can I just check that you're seeing my title slide only? Yeah.
Yes, no notes.
Perfect, because I've not been using Zoom that much now that we're able to get out the house again, so a bit rusty. Thanks, Joe. I'm going to talk today about some work that we've been running with, I will explain this term in a minute, but what we refer to as bidialectals, and we're running language switching paradigms, essentially trying to investigate the cognitive processes that are involved in using more than one language variety. The work I'm going to present today has been published as a stage 1 registered report. So as Saloni was alluding to, the things like the design hypothesis, your analysis plan are all peer reviewed. I'm not going to go too heavy into sort of theory or anything in my talk. This paper is probably, if you're interested in more, is a good starting point. So maybe I will go into a little bit of theory. So models of bilingual language control propose that a bilingual's languages are always active and they're always competing for selection to some extent. So when a bilingual plans to speak in a particular target language, they have to inhibit or suppress all the items from the other non-target language they have to inhibit them so to prevent any cross-language interference. So in this example, if you wanted to name this animal, the bilingual would have to inhibit the German word to allow them to select the English word, dog. And the amount of inhibition that's required to do this is relative to how strongly represented or dominant that language is. So in this case, let's say English is their more dominant language, it would take more energy, in a sense, to suppress this to allow them to speak the German word. However, it can take a while for that inhibition to wear off, meaning that in relative terms, it can take longer to switch back to your dominant language compared to switching into your less dominant language. So these effects are commonly measured using language switching paradigms, and a typical setup here is that a participant is asked to name pictures of objects and usually given some kind of cue as to which language variety they should name the object in. We're interested in how accurate they are, but predominantly we're interested in how quickly they can do this. And by measuring the response times, we can observe the effects of things like naming in your dominant versus your non-dominant language, the effects of switching from language A to B or from language B to A, and so on. Generally, what you find in these paradigms is that switching between varieties takes longer to name the object than if you had already sort of remained within the same language setting. So there are different types of language environments a bilingual could find themselves in, which might require different applications of language control. So for example, a bilingual could find themselves in a single language environment, and what they can do here is proactively apply language control to keep a higher activation level of one language, because they might have no expectation that they will require the use of their other language. And in language switching paradigms, we can tap into this by using single language blocks. So this is where the participant would be informed that they will only name in one language variety throughout. And again, they would have no expectation of having to shift gears and to use a different variety. A bilingual could also find themselves in a mixed language environment where they have to reactively switch languages on the fly, depending on who they are communicating with at any given moment. And we can measure this in language switching paradigms by using mixed language blocks. Usually this involves the participant being cued as to which language variety they need to name the object in. Often that's a color cue. And these are often presented in an unpredictable sequence, so the bilingual can't anticipate what language they'll have to use on the next trial until that picture and its corresponding border appear. These kind of blocks give us different types of trials. So we have within these what we'd call repetition trials, which are trials in which you have named in a particular language having stayed within the same variety compared to the previous trial. And we also have switch trials that require you to switch from one variety to the other, basically shifting these different mental settings. And we can also, this can involve switching from language A to B or from language B to A. And again, trials that involve switching tend to take longer than trials that require you to remain within the same variety. Now, a common finding in bilingual research is that there is a mixing cost associated with having to use more than one variety. And what this, basically what we generally find is that trials in single language blocks are named faster than repetition trials from mixed language blocks, despite both types of trials basically involving having named within the same variety from one trial to the next. But basically in a mixed language block, the anticipation of potentially having to use your other variety and to switch to it means that both languages maintain a higher level of activation, which is causing these slower responses. So that's the mixing cost. You're slower when you're having to mix your languages. There's also another type of language setting a bilingual could find themselves in, where they're presented with speakers who speak both their languages. So they're basically able to use their languages freely and mix them, sometimes even within the same sentence. So in a sense, this kind of setting might not require any kind of language control because it's just a case of an anything goes. It doesn't matter what word I use from what language, who I'm communicating with will understand me. And in terms of language switching, we can investigate this using voluntary language switching blocks. So this is where the bilingual will be told to name each picture with whatever comes to mind. Doesn't matter which language, just whatever names comes to mind first. So in this case, they might name that first picture in language A. They might then stay within that language and name the next picture within language A as well. They might then switch into language B. And again, they could then remain within that language. What we then do is subsequently code what language they used for each trial and whether that trial formed a repetition or a switch. And what we find here is a mixing benefit. It's in some studies at least. So previous studies by bilinguals have found a mixing benefit when you are able to voluntarily choose the language. So basically, in this case, the bilinguals are often faster to name repetition trials from the mixed block than they are to name the single language trials from the single language block, presumably because they're not having to employ any language control in the voluntary block, and in the single language block, they are having to suppress the other variety because they know they won't be using it. Whereas in the mixed voluntary block, they are free to use whatever comes to mind. So we've previously investigated whether similar effects exist for, as have been found for bilinguals, for speakers of closely related language varieties. And in our research, we've used speakers of Scots, which is a Germanic variety closely related to English. It has, from the last census, something like 1.5 million speakers. It's recognised by the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages as a minority language, but its status as a language is often questioned, and even the speakers themselves might not regard themselves as bilingual. In our previous studies using adaptations of language switching paradigms, we found lots of similar effects as are found for bilinguals. So essentially, we're seeing in these participants bilingual effects, even though they would regard themselves as monolingual. And why do they do that? Well, Scots is a sort of stigmatized variety. It's often considered quite low status. I'm just throwing up a couple of examples of tweets where, in response to somebody who was speaking Scots, so you can see, you know, it's not considered, you know, people are not very favorable towards it sometimes. And even speakers themselves don't necessarily regard it as a different language. In this government report from a few years back, 64% of respondents said that they didn't think of Scots as a language, it was just a way of speaking. And in a sense, we can think of it more like a register. You know, it's kind of like a formal or informal way of talking. In this sense, more of an informal way of talking. So in the present study, we wanted to investigate whether our so-called bidialectal speakers would display this mixing benefit that has been found for more traditionally recognised bilinguals. So to do this, we used speakers of Scottish Standard English, which is essentially what I'm speaking now, and Dundonian Scots, which is the Scots dialect spoken in Dundee. As I mentioned, this was a registered report. We ended up with 46 participants, which was our target. They reported using Dundonian around 26% of the time. As Joe has said, I've used the local media, radio, newspapers, and social media to recruit our participants. And we paid them £15 for participating. I should say that recruitment platforms like Prolific do actually have questions in their demographics about Scots. We decided not to use that because from our experience, a lot of speakers themselves don't even know what Scots is. They might think of it as something that other people in other parts of Scotland speak. And because we were using stimuli that was related to Dundonian Scots, Prolific doesn't drill that deep. So you know, you don't have to travel very far for people to start using different names and stuff. So to keep it, you know, within this dialect region, we recruited ourselves. One drawback to using the local media is that you can never be sure of what headlines they're going to put your picture next to. So just a couple of unfortunate incidents where my face has appeared next to these headlines. I really should get lawyers involved at some point. So we used Gorilla to run this language switching paradigm. The materials are available as open materials, and this consisted of participants completing a single language block in one variety. They then moved on to completing 4 voluntary blocks where they could pick whichever item came to mind, and then they would finish by completing another single language block in the other variety, and we counterbalanced the order of those across the participants. We used, in this study, only used non-cognate items, so these are items that don't have any phonological overlap with each other, so that would be things like girl and lassie, ears and lugs, earwig and forky taily, and sandwich and peace. And participants completed this at home. It only required the use of a device that had a microphone, mostly desktop PCs and laptops. And because we're capturing their audio, we required a quiet environment. So what we then did with their audio trials is we took them and re-uploaded them into a new task so that we could code their accuracy for the single language blocks where they were instructed what they had to name. And for the voluntary blocks, we could then code which variety they had used in that for that trial. And we also uploaded the audio files to Cronset, which extracts their response times. And combining these together basically gives us what we need for our analysis. So what did we find? In terms of this mixing analysis, we are comparing here the trials from the single language blocks with the repetition trials from the voluntary blocks. And we use linear mixed effects models to do this. We found the main effect of language variety in that the standard English items were named more slowly than the dialect items. Bearing in mind, prior to the task, we'd controlled for things like word length and things like that. So people were slower to name in the standard than they were the dialect. We didn't find any effect of block type. So the single language trials and the voluntary repetition trials were approximately pretty much the same. And we didn't find an interaction between language variety and block type either. So our take home here is that we didn't find any evidence for a mixing benefit in this group of speakers, but nor did we find any mixing cost. I haven't reported it here, but we also measured the switching cost in the voluntary blocks, and we did find the same effect that you would find for bilinguals. So some aspects replicated, but we didn't observe any mixing benefit or cost here. And although all our previous studies that we've done with these types of bidialectals have shown effects that we find for bilinguals, this is the first time we've not found a similar effect. So it suggests that potentially the bidialectal and bilingual language control processes are not necessarily identical, but this has given us more work for us to investigate this further. So I'd just like to thank my collaborator, Dr. Mathieu de Klerk, and the Carnegie Trust, who funded this research. And that's me.
Neil, that's fabulous. You snuck it in there in the middle. Did I get it right that you got these auditory recordings online and then you extracted those auditory recordings and then you put those back on Prolific and got Prolific workers to score them for
No.
you?
That, in this case, I mean, we could do that. It's crossed my mind to do that. No, we for this purpose coded them ourselves.
Right.
But used a task in Gorilla to do that, because then it's easy to share amongst people. And it's
and you can get 3 ratings for each one and see how that's
exactly together. Yeah. So I've done that. We've done that in all our experiments. Basically, create a. It's also available as open materials if anybody fancies it. Like an accuracy coding task that again just uses the platform because Gorilla is so easy to use.
Oh, thanks, Neil. No, I do know other researchers who do put their accuracy coding back onto Prolific and get their Prolific workers to do it for them, which seems to work really well as well. And then all the ones where they sit together, they let them through, and then when there's a disparity, they go and check them manually. Yeah, they do them themselves, so that works quite well. Now, you didn't say a lot about what it was like recruiting with using media. I know you've recruited in the newspapers and using radio. Can you just say a little bit more about that? And while Neil is chatting, if you've got other questions, put them into the Q&A and hopefully I will get around to them.
So one aspect of this work is it seems to capture sort of the public's interest, and anytime we put a press release out about this, we always get some kind of coverage. So it always makes this sort of, I guess, a bit of a quirky news story sometimes. So there's been a couple of experiences when I first got this funding and launched my lab, and we were running some studies. I did some radio interviews on national radio, which led to, I think, 2 participants responding, and neither had usable data. So almost like the bigger that the sort of broader the reach, the less beneficial it was, because it wasn't necessarily relevant to everyone. When we've done this we actually ran 2 projects at the same time, so we recruited for both of them this way. I certainly found a lot of interest, a lot of emails coming from people who are interested, but actually the follow through of people to complete it was maybe only about 50%. So I'm here today to hear other people's tips for recruitment, because I'm finding when I don't use a recruitment platform, even when I'm paying, I have to say, quite generously for participation, even using media, sometimes there are still challenges with getting people who have shown an interest to follow through to that completion. So I tried a few little tips, like a bit of nudging, a bit of this that might only be, the study might only run until we've got an X number of participants. Kind of didn't work. I think all it did was backfire slightly, and people thought, oh, I've missed it. I should have done it yesterday. So it has its challenges, but certainly we wouldn't have, I think, recruited in the time period that we did without that media coverage. It was a huge help.
Okay, so it helps, but it's not the nirvana that we're all hoping for.
Potentially, I think the other aspect is what I've noticed with this type of speech production research. I think people are just that bit more hesitant about doing it. I think people can be slightly more self-conscious about doing this type of work. It also requires that they have, you know, a particular type of setup, and that they can do it in a place where there's no distractions. And, you know, often at home that isn't the case. So that can sometimes, I think, be a slight barrier. It's, yeah, I think with more comprehension based, or where they weren't having to produce, I think we would have got been more successful, I think.
Yeah, it's sort of the death by 1,000 cuts, isn't it? That you lose a few because of this and a few because of that,
exactly.
and a few because of that, and each time you're like, oh,
exactly.
I've only got a few.
Yeah.
Have you ever tried recruiting with charity partners? Like, are there Scottish charities that focus particularly on regions?
No, that's maybe a good shout.
Oh, want to go and try?
I've got a few connections because this this language variety forms part of the Scots language. I've got a few connections like that where I've been able to recruit. Basically, with any of these tasks, we use every tactic we can think of. So there's a few things like that. But yeah, that's certainly something, especially now that we might be able to, not everything has to be done online. In terms of how you reach people in the first place. So yeah, something to think about for sure.
There's a question for you in the Q&A from Sauchin. 2 questions about the procedure. Did you record a participant's responses in a block from the first to last trial? And how did you decide the onset of each vocal response?
So what the audio, what's it called? The audio recording zone does is it captures every response on a trial by trial basis. So we didn't have to then splice them out into individual trials. We get an output that is basically an audio output for every single trial, and we use the Cronset system, which is an online sort of server you can upload your files into, and it extracts the response times. In some of our previous studies, what we've done is taken a sample of the audio, and we've manually measured them as well, and we've shown that, you know, they're pretty much bang on. So I'm quite trusting of the Cronset system to give me some accurate responses. In our accuracy coding, what we also have is if we can detect extraneous noise, we'll code that as a basically a no or other sound. So we know to exclude it because the reaction time measurement might have been messed up. So we have that kind of extra quality check when we're doing our accuracy coding.
Brilliant. I'm sure there are lots of auditory researchers here who are going to be delighted to hear about Cronset. So audience, in the chat, if you can share what was the one message you took away from Neil's talk today that you're going to take back to your research, what was helpful, that would be fantastic. That's your thank you to Neil. Neil, you've been great. I think we're out of time now, so we need Miles to come to the stage and present his research on social psychology. Hi, Miles. Lovely to have you back here.
Hi, Joe. It's great to be back.
Fantastic.
Screen.
Over to you whenever you're ready.
Have I shared the correct screen? That's the question. Share the screen. Are you seeing my slides?
I am seeing your slides, yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and they're full screen and I can't see any notes.
Okay, great. Wonderful.
Over to you.
Thanks, Joe. Hello, everyone. And it's, as Joe says, great to be back. I was here 2 years ago now in BeOnline 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. And back then, I shared a few insights in terms of some of the work that we'd started to do to try and transition our paradigms into an online environment. And as Joe introduced me as, yes, I research social cognition. And I noticed in the chat earlier that there were a number of people here that are interested in attention allocation, distractor suppression, social cognition, executive control. So hopefully those people there will find some things of interest here in terms of how we've transitioned our paradigms in social cognition into the online environment using Gorilla. So what I thought I'd start off by just give you a little bit of a quick background in terms of what my research is about. So rather obscurely describe this talk as socially embedded distractor suppression. Most broadly, I'd say that what I'm interested in is the way in which context shape the way information is prioritized. So the way information is prioritized in cognition, what we upweight, what we downweight, how does context shape that? And one way to think about information prioritization is to think in terms of distraction. So here's the most distracting thing that I could find off the internet, the Moomins, and you can imagine a person in this environment here being distracted. And you can think of the distractions in terms of things that are task relevant and task irrelevant. So there is a sort of conflict between these two pieces of information. So there is some element here of requirement for prioritization to the stuff that's important. So down weighting distractors, perhaps up weighting targets in order to adapt to this sort of task relevancy. Now, the way we've gone about operationalizing this is actually to think of it in terms of semantic interference paradigms here in this case. Well, interference paradigms more generally, but here I'm going to talk specifically about semantic interference. So I'm just going to move this so I can actually see what I've got on my slide here. Okay, so let me just explain the base paradigm that we're looking at. So in this paradigm, participants would see a target here, the target being the picture, a dog, and some sort of form of distractor, which would be a word on top. Now, the distractor can come in two flavors. So the task itself is that the participant has to identify the picture here in the sense of a dog, and they have to say the word dog, and the distractor on top is a stapler, which is semantically unrelated. So there is no semantic connection between stapler and dog. They are of different categories. However, in another condition, there could be a distractor on top of the word here, mouse, which is actually of the same category, semantic category, in which there would be a conflict, and these are related. And what you find is that that semantic relatedness actually slows down slightly the identification of the target picture underneath. So relating it back to what I was talking about there in terms of prioritization of information, here we've got two pieces of information, and what we want to do is prioritize the target here, which is the dog, but that prioritization of the target is being interfered with the distractor information here, the word on top, which is obviously also being processed in some way. So this here's some data. This is some data that we collected actually pre-pandemic in the lab of just a basic paradigm participants on their own, just doing the PWI test. And what you get is this, what we call a semantic interference effect of about 42 milliseconds here. So they are 42 milliseconds slower to identify the dog when the word on top is related in meaning, is the basic idea. Now, what we're going to ask here is if we socially embed participants. So we put participants in a social situation where we divide up the task. So what we're saying here is, can we change the way that the distracting information on top is processed, depending on whether that's being looked after by another person? So here we have a second participant come in, and we tell the participant that this other person is going to take care of that mouse information. And then the participant still has to identify the dog. So the partner says mouse, and the participants and dog. And the basic hypothesis and idea here was, could we change the way that that distracting information is prioritized, maybe deprioritized, because now the participant believes it's being taken care of by their partner. Now, what we did pre-pandemic is we brought people in the lab. We had two conditions, an alone condition where they sat side by side across a partition, where they either had the computers disconnected or connected, and they either believed that they were working together or alone. And in the together condition, the key manipulation was that the belief that your partner was looking after that word. They were doing a task on the word. And in this case, the participant, rather than speak the word, they just had to decide whether the last letter of the target picture ended in a vowel or a consonant. So remember, dog, it ends in a consonant. So they had to press the 9 key on their keyboard if it was consonant, or the 1 key if it's a vowel. And their partner, looking after the word, had to decide how many vowels were in the word. But it didn't really matter, just the idea that the partner was in some way looking after that information. And what we found is that we got this, okay, this was the base result that I showed you, the 42 milliseconds. We found this really curious result, that what happened when your partner looked after that piece of information, or you just believed it, and let me remind you here, the partner there is a confederate, so that actual participant partner is actually doing nothing. They just sat there, they just believe. That mere belief was actually reducing the degree to which that distracting information was being processed, and you were negating the semantic interference. We removed semantic interference. This automatic processing information was being shaped by the context in which you found yourself in. So we were really very excited about this. We were really excited about all the different possibilities that we could do moving forward. And then the pandemic hit. So then we had to try and find a way of transitioning it online. And this is some of the work I briefly presented the first time at BeOnline, but I didn't have the punchline yet of how it all worked out. So I'm going to go through some of the basic results that we found and some of the manipulations that we then followed up on to try and show you some of the things you can do in terms of social cognition research in an online environment. So there were 3 areas in which we found in our experience over the last couple of years that have worked rather well in terms of transitioning online. So first thing was that we gamified. So we turned the basic semantic interference paradigm, the PWI paradigm, into something called the picture word game. Okay, and here's, sorry about that. Is that going to work? Yep. So we had this idea, you come into the game, you connect to some servers, you log in, and this was all possible in the Guerrilla environment. And then we just tried to be a little bit creative, get them the sense that they were some sort of player participant that came online into a game to play this picture word game, and that they would be playing potentially with someone else. So this was the second thing. We had something sort of social presence, where we tried to get them to meet a confederate online, and we had these social pixels where they had an avatar on the top right-hand corner that would represent the other party. So here we pretended that they were finding a word master, they'd find someone else, that other person would come online, they would come online, we were able to turn the video camera on of the other person, they would meet someone. So there was also creating this minimal social context, obviously all not real, but we got tried to deceive our participants into believing this. And then another thing we tried to do, which worked very well, was have these shared workspaces where we pretended that they were actually going to share their screens. So we had this pretend shared screen area where they gave permissions, and then they accepted permissions, and then they had this shared display. So they believed that they were working on the same screen, they were sharing their screens. Here they also typed in their name, they logged on, they had their name come in the top left-hand corner, and then they saw their partner type on the screen to give that sense that they were also on the shared screen, and then their name would come in the top right-hand corner. So some of this, I think I presented earlier versions of this the first time. This is the more refined version, and this has worked remarkably well for us. These 3 pillars have worked well, and we've found, as you'll see, some very interesting results using this manipulation for the minimal social context online. Okay, so what does that all culminate in? Well, this is what it looks like, the actual paradigm itself. You've got the picture word interference paradigm, the stimuli in the middle where you've got pictures and words on top. Half of them are related, half of them are unrelated. As I say, the manipulation here is the relatedness slows you down. And then you've got this framing, this social framing. You're on a shared screen, you believe someone else is there, you believe you're working with someone. So what we were doing was comparing whether we would get the same effect in the lab online if you believed that there was someone there, player 2 here, Chris, or not someone there, no one online playing with you. Okay, so this is what we found. On the left-hand side, I've got the lab result. The 42 milliseconds reduced and negated to -1 millisecond. And what we found is we replicated the no partner condition where they weren't paired with someone. This is the online result. We got a nice 33 millisecond PWI semantic interference effect, slightly slower on the related word. And once again, we found that that was removed when you believed that you were connected with someone online. So we were very, very encouraged by this. We were a little bit dubious where we could create that minimal context in an online environment. There's lots of distractions and so forth, but actually we found a lot of people found it very believable, and they very much commented afterwards saying that they really felt, say hi to that person, would very much enjoy playing with that person and so forth. And they really, really got through the gamification, the idea of what we were trying to get at, what the task was about, and we were able to replicate the result with great consistency. So what did we think? So I'm going to go through some of the manipulations that we did. Well, we thought we could play around with this a little bit. I'm just going to go through this a little bit like a whistle-stop tour of some of the things that we've done, a bit of sort of smorgasbord of things that we've tried in terms of manipulating the social context. So this is what it looks like when you meet someone. This is me meeting Philip, who's the Confederate that has been the Confederate in about 1,000 of the participants that I've collected in my studies. He's been great. He's famous, but famously underpaid. And what we thought is, well, we could change who that person is, right? So one of the things that we thought, well, one of the hypotheses which we've had from the previous study is whether social status affects the degree to which you are able to offload that information. So the idea here is that you're deprioritizing that interfering information when it's looked after by someone else. This gives us the idea that you're offloading that information to someone else. Would you offload that information to someone else if you believe that they were of higher or lower social status? perhaps if you trusted them more because they're of high status, you're more likely to offload than you were if someone of low status. How sophisticated is this effect? To what degree can this high-level social constructs interact with these low-level automatic mechanisms? So what we did, this was actually did with a series of third years, we got third years to record themselves both in low status gear, like dressed down, messy backgrounds, student sort of hovel sort of thing, and then dressed up in high status with smart backgrounds and so forth. And we were trying to look, how does this affect, just the image, affect the degree to which you are going to do this social offloading that we thought is the effect that we're sort of investigating. And this is the BeOnline result again. So this was just with a partner online, not a partner offline, 33-9. And what we found is this: with the low status, you get this interference effect of 37 milliseconds, and with the high status, that's removed. And this is fascinating even more so because in both conditions here, both conditions are social. So you're both meeting someone. The only thing that's different is the way you've construed that person. So in one status, you believe they are low status, and the other one, you believe they are high status. And the low status is disrupting the offloading of that information to someone else, such that you're bringing back that interference. You're processing that information again. Perhaps you're not trusting them with that information. Here's another manipulation that we ran where we thought, well, social status comes in different forms, prestige, but also competency. Is it the fact that you believe that the other person is competent enough to look after that information? So here, using Gorilla again, we try to manipulate the degree to which you believe they were good at the task, your partner. So we either told them that they were the 148th ranked word master, so that was the name of the person that was your partner in this game, or the 25th ranked in the top 15% of all word masters. Does a high competency person or a low competency person change the degree to which you process that information? And again, this is the basic online result, always on the left. And what we found is yes, in the low competency, you get this standard interference effect. Here, a little bit larger, actually 51 milliseconds, a strong interference effect, but in the high competency condition, that disappears. So when you believe just that you're working with someone of high competence, again, as both conditions are social, you're able to remove the effect of processing that word information. You're no longer processing that word information in the same way. This is social context shaping information processing. This is one of my favorites that we ran. We were thinking about other ways to increase prosociality, right? Because if this is about cooperation or trust and so forth, well, there's a whole area of literature in terms of synchrony, behavioral synchrony. If you can increase behavioral synchrony between two people, you increase the likelihood for prosociality subsequently. So here, what we did, we had a bit of time, bit of fun trying to work out how to do this. On the top level here is the computer automatically giving a response of an avatar, left and right, okay? And the bottom, that is an actual participant responding. So they could press their buttons on their keys and their avatar would come up spontaneously on the screen. And what we told them is that your partner is pressing and you just have to match them, okay? But in one condition, we had it really easy. They were doing but. But in the other condition, Chris was a bit annoying and he was all over the place, very, very unsynchronized. And what we found is that when you perceived Chris to be asynchronous, you had a low self-other overlap, one of the ways of measuring affiliation. And when you perceived him to be synchronous, you had a very high level of self-other overlap. But what we're interested in, does this translate into the offloading effect that I've talked about so far? Again, the basic online result. And then, yes, we did find this as well, right? So in the low synchrony condition, you get the standard interference effect, but in the high synchrony condition, that is removed again. So when you believe that you've worked with someone that is in sync with you, you are more likely to not process that information, that word information that we're saying you've offloaded to the other person, and therefore it doesn't cost you in the same way as it would if you work with a low synchronous person. Okay, final one I just want to talk about. Run recently, this was actually run in a student lab. We were interested in group membership. So another one of those big other areas in social psychology that we wanted to connect up. If we try to group people on the basis of whether they saw a spinning ballerina, this is an illusion. So we had this on Gorilla, watch the spin around. Do you see that moving clockwise or anti-clockwise? If you saw it moving clockwise, I think I remember we called you the lefties. If you saw it moving anti-clockwise, or is it the other way around? The anti-clockwise, the lefties, and the clockwise, the righties. So we tried to put you into two minimal groups. This is, if you want to look at this, good work by Steve Riker talking about minimal group formation, okay? Now, does forming minimal groups, in-groups and out-groups, then affect the degree to which you process that other information? And this result actually came out slightly differently than what we expected. We expected that you would offload to your in-group and not offload to your out group, but we found completely the opposite. We found that actually in your in-group, you've got this offloading effect, but when you work with an out-group member, you remove that interference effect in line with the other. Now, I could go on and talk a little bit some of the ideas why we think that is, but actually just the thing that I want to emphasize in this talk is the remarkable consistency of our online data. And that we were able to take this basic effect, we were able to then use these very, very global, high-level, complex social constructs and implement them in an online environment and get these very, very low-level, precise effects on a consistent basis. Highly encouraging. We were consistently able to turn off semantic interference on the basis of the context in which you find yourself in. So how am I doing for time? I think I've got about just 30 seconds to wrap up. So in terms of theory, well, this is all around this idea for us that cognition is embedded within the social world. This embedded effect cultivates these implicit attunements. We're sort of talking about these implicit automaticities being tuned into the social world. They're not black boxed off. They are sensitive to the constructs we find around us. And this may be a skill-based thing that you're implicitly leveraging others to regulate the way that you process information. And we want to talk to social offloading being the skill of being better together. But I'm just going to rush through that slightly because I just want to finish by talking about some of the insights that I found in terms of working online. And I keep on getting this thing in the way, so I can't read my slide. So the transition online for us has proved very smooth, and we've generated consistent data passing on multi-studies. That's one thing that hopefully I've shown you. And I want to obviously demonstrate that online behavioral data has the sensitivity to pick up on these minimal social effects. Okay, so we were worried that that might not be the case. Obviously, these online environments are a little bit more noisy, but actually what we found is they do translate through, and we were finding these consistent effects. We have also received consistent high levels of believability using the framework that I've showed you, and we've excluded participants who did not believe, but we're entering sort of the mid-90s in terms of believability. And we've not actually, one analysis that I want to do, and I haven't been able to get around to doing, is looking at that 5% to see whether we're not getting the effect in that last 5% that we are in the major 95%. One big thing that I found that has been a big improvement is gamification. That's been a huge step change in terms of maintaining engagement and the understanding of the task. We do have attention checks throughout our paradigm where we ask people to perform the task, to get over a certain level, then they pass and they can go through to the actual main task. But actually we found that dropout rates significantly dropped once we actually achieved this gamified environment where they believed that they were playing a game and they were actually enjoying being a part of this environment in which we were trying to create. So I think I might well stop there because actually that time went much quicker than I thought. Thanks to Professor Danny Richardson, collaborator, Gorilla, thanks to Joe, Nick, and the team and all the students for sort of collecting data with me.
Miles, that's extraordinary. And I've never had a talk on language followed by a talk on social cognition, this semantic Stroop task, essential interference. Yes. And it just, you know, you've contextualized so much of what Neil was talking about. Yes. Because of course, when you're talking language to another person who's a bidialectal like you, are you doing this social offloading because they understand this as well or not, right? Like, we can't think about language just in the situation where you're just one person who's speaking, because the whole purpose of language is that it sits within a social context. So you've made me have completely new thoughts that I haven't had before. I'm sure other people have had these thoughts before.
No, absolutely. It was a great follow on from Neil. Yes.
Yeah. What a happy marriage. One question that came to me, there are some questions in the Q&A that we'll come to, and anybody else who's online now who has a question for Miles, dump them in the Q&A. And Miles, if people have other questions, are they welcome to reach out to you?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, so people can reach out to you. How do you do all those animations? Because like, obviously we now actually have multiplayer in Gorilla, so you could actually do this as a multiplayer experiment, but you didn't. You did a fake multiplayer experiment and you made it look like a game with all these fancy animations. How did you make those?
A lot of making of GIFs.
Right.
Yes. So we create a lot of GIFs, which we then, either created, I don't know, in PowerPoint or some other form of PNG, and then we sort of imported them into the Gorilla platform and so forth. Right. But obviously, one of the things that we're very excited about is multiplayer, and so that's one of the things we want to try and automate that a little bit more and bring it into that environment and so forth. But a lot of this stuff was done about sort of a year and a half ago when we were first starting out and trying to develop that. So we had to be innovative and creative in terms of the way in which we could create these environments. Yes.
Brilliant. So one top tip for people, if you want to make your tasks more game-like, it really is just a simple simple as changing your images to GIFs, putting a bit of movement in them, creating a bit of a fiction. And even in the task builder, you can create some game-like experiences. Let me go to the Q&A. Oh, no open questions at the moment. There's a question in the chat though. Do you measure social influence or need for uniqueness of your respondents?
Do we measure social need for uniqueness?
Measure social influence or the need for uniqueness of your respondents. Maybe these moderate your findings. Dr. Mustanza, can you say more about this? Is this the idea that if the participants feel that they're similar to each other, that they are like one in-group, whereas if they're more different to each other, they're more different? Is that the idea you're getting at? We'll see. Yes, that's the question. So do you look at how different the participant perceives themselves to be to the confederate?
That's a very nice question, and it's actually one of the areas that we were looking into, is a degree of social closeness or social similarity. That's where we sort of went around the group membership stuff on a sort of more group level. But yes, definitely that's something that would be an interesting way to get at, again, the way that the social world modulates it. I think the key point here is that we can't think of our brains or cognition as separate from the world. We have to think of them as embedded and therefore built from the bottom up in the world, and therefore shaped by the things that we encounter in this world, one of which could well be social influence. And so social distance and social overlap are one of those things that we would expect maybe shape the way the information is prioritized or deprioritized. I never talked about mechanism as well. And so mechanism here may be well attention, right? So selective attention, the way that we attend to things or downregulate attention, that could be the way that this is being mediated.
Brilliant. Miles, thank you. You might, Mustanza might want to chat with you further in the chat. We're now going to go to our next speaker.